An American Tragedy. A novel by Theodore Dreiser, 1925. Book 1. Chapter 1. Dusk, of a summer night. And the tall walls of the commercial heart of an American city of perhaps 400,000 inhabitants, such walls as in time may linger as a mere fable. And up the broad street, now comparatively hushed, a little band of a man of about 50, short, stout, with bushy hair protruding from under a round black felt hat, a most unimportant-looking person, who carried a small portable organ such as is customarily used by street preachers and singers. And with him a woman perhaps 5 years his junior, taller, not so broad, but solid of frame and vigorous, very plain in face and dress, and yet not homely, leading with one hand a small boy of 7 and in the other carrying a Bible and several hymn books. With these three, but walking independently behind, was a girl of 15, a boy of 12 and another girl of 9, all following obediently, but not too enthusiastically, in the wake of the others. It was hot, yet with a sweet languor about it all. Crossing at right angles the great thoroughfare on which they walked, was a second canyon-like way, threaded by throngs and vehicles and various lines of cars which clanged their bells and made such progress as they might amid swiftly moving streams of traffic. Yet the little group seemed unconscious of anything save a set purpose to make its way between the contending lines of traffic and pedestrians which flowed by them. Having reached an intersection this side of the second principal thoroughfare, really just an alley between two tall structures, now quite bare of life of any kind, the man put down the organ, which the woman immediately opened, setting up a music rack upon which she placed a wide flat hymn book. Then handing the Bible to the man, she fell back in line with him, while the 12-year-old boy put down a small camp stool in front of the organ. The man, the father, as he chanced to be, looked about him with seeming wide-eyed assurance, and announced, without appearing to care whether he had any auditors or not, "We will first sing a hymn of praise, so that any who may wish to acknowledge the Lord may join us. Will you oblige, Hester?" At this the eldest girl, who until now had attempted to appear as unconscious and unaffected as possible, bestowed her rather slim and as yet undeveloped figure upon the camp chair and turned the leaves of the hymn book, pumping the organ while her mother observed, "I should think it might be nice to sing 27 tonight, how sweet the balm of Jesus' love." By this time various homeward-bound individuals of diverse grades and walks of life, noticing the small group disposing itself in this fashion, hesitated for a moment to eye them askance or paused to ascertain the character of their work. This hesitancy, construed by the man apparently to constitute attention, however mobile, was seized upon by him and he began addressing them as though they were specifically here to hear him. "Let us all sing 27, then, how sweet the balm of Jesus' love." At this the young girl began to interpret the melody upon the organ, emitting a thin though correct strain, at the same time joining her rather high soprano with that of her mother, together with the rather dubious baritone of the father. The other children piped weakly along, the boy and girl having taken hymn books from the small pile stacked upon the organ. As they sang, this nondescript and indifferent street audience gazed, held by the peculiarity of such an unimportant-looking family publicly raising its collective voice against the vast skepticism and apathy of life. Some were interested or moved sympathetically by the rather tame and inadequate figure of the girl at the organ, others by the impractical and materially inefficient texture of the father, whose weak blue eyes and rather flabby but poorly clothed figure bespoke more of failure than anything else. Of the group the mother alone stood out as having that force and determination which, however blind or erroneous, makes for self-preservation, if not success in life. She, more than any of the others, stood up with an ignorant, yet somehow respectable air of conviction. If you had watched her, her hymn book dropped to her side, her glance directed straight before her into space, you would have said, "Well, here is one who, whatever her defects, probably does what she believes as nearly as possible." A kind of hard, fighting faith in the wisdom and mercy of that definite overruling and watchful power which she proclaimed, was written in her every feature and gesture. "The love of Jesus saves me whole, the love of God my steps control," she sang resonantly, if slightly nasally, between the towering walls of the adjacent buildings. The boy moved restlessly from one foot to the other, keeping his eyes down, and for the most part only half singing. A tall and as yet slight figure, surmounted by an interesting head and face, white skin, dark hair, he seemed more keenly observant and decidedly more sensitive than most of the others, appeared indeed to resent and even to suffer from the position in which he found himself. Plainly pagan rather than religious, life interested him, although as yet he was not fully aware of this. All that could be truly said of him now was that there was no definite appeal in all this for him. He was too young, his mind much too responsive to phases of beauty and pleasure which had little, if anything, to do with the remote and cloudy romance which swayed the minds of his mother and father. Indeed, the home life of which this boy found himself a part and the various contacts, material and psychic, which thus far had been his, did not tend to convince him of the reality and force of all that his mother and father seemed so certainly to believe and say. Rather, they seemed more or less troubled in their lives, at least materially. His father was always reading the Bible and speaking in meeting at different places, especially in the mission, which he and his mother conducted not so far from this corner. At the same time, as he understood it, they collected money from various interested or charitably inclined businessmen here and there who appeared to believe in such philanthropic work. Yet the family was always hard up, never very well clothed, and deprived of many comforts and pleasures which seemed common enough to others. And his father and mother were constantly proclaiming the love and mercy and care of God for him and for all. Plainly there was something wrong somewhere. He could not get it all straight, but still he could not help respecting his mother, a woman whose force and earnestness, as well as her sweetness, appealed to him. Despite much mission work and family cares, she managed to be fairly cheerful, or at least sustaining, often declaring most emphatically God will provide or God will show the way, especially in times of too great stress about food or clothes. Yet apparently, in spite of this, as he and all the other children could see, God did not show any very clear way, even though there was always an extreme necessity for his favorable intervention in their affairs. Tonight, walking up the great street with his sisters and brother, he wished that they need not do this anymore, or at least that he need not be a part of it. Other boys did not do such things, and besides, somehow it seemed shabby and even degrading. On more than one occasion, before he had been taken on the street in this fashion, other boys had called to him and made fun of his father, because he was always publicly emphasizing his religious beliefs or convictions. Thus in one neighborhood in which they had lived, when he was but a child of 7, his father, having always preluded every conversation with "Praise the Lord," he heard boys call "Here comes old Praise the Lord Griffiths." Or they would call out after him, "Hey, you're the fellow whose sister plays the organ. Is there anything else she can play? What does he always want to go around saying, 'Praise the Lord' for? Other people don't do it." It was that old mass yearning for a likeness in all things that troubled them, and him. Neither his father nor his mother was like other people, because they were always making so much of religion, and now at last they were making a business of it. On this night in this great street with its cars and crowds and tall buildings, he felt ashamed, dragged out of normal life, to be made a show and jest of. The handsome automobiles that sped by, the loitering pedestrians moving off to what interests and comforts he could only surmise, the gay pairs of young people, laughing and jesting and the kids staring, all troubled him with a sense of something different, better, more beautiful than his, or rather their life. And now units of this vagrom and unstable street throng, which was forever shifting and changing about them, seemed to sense the psychologic error of all this in so far as these children were concerned, for they would nudge one another, the more sophisticated and indifferent lifting an eyebrow and smiling contemptuously, the more sympathetic or experienced commenting on the useless presence of these children. "I see these people around here nearly every night now, 2 or 3 times a week, anyhow," This from a young clerk who had just met his girl and was escorting her toward a restaurant. "They're just working some religious dodge or other, I guess. That oldest boy don't want to be here. He feels out of place, I can see that. It ain't right to make a kid like that come out unless he wants to. He can't understand all this stuff, anyhow." This from an idler and loafer of about 40, one of those odd hangers-on about the commercial heart of a city, addressing a pausing and seemingly amiable stranger. "Yay, I guess that's so," the other assented, taking in the peculiar cast of the boy's head and face. In view of the uneasy and self-conscious expression upon the face whenever it was lifted, one might have intelligently suggested that it was a little unkind as well as idle to thus publicly force upon a temperament as yet unfitted to absorb their import, religious and psychic services best suited to reflective temperaments of maturer years. Yet so it was. As for the remainder of the family, both the youngest girl and boy were too small to really understand much of what it was all about or to care. The eldest girl at the organ appeared not so much to mind, as to enjoy the attention and comment her presence and singing evoked, for more than once, not only strangers, but her mother and father, had assured her that she had an appealing and compelling voice, which was only partially true. It was not a good voice. They did not really understand music. Physically, she was of a pale, emasculate and unimportant structure, with no real mental force or depth, and was easily made to feel that this was an excellent field in which to distinguish herself and attract a little attention. As for the parents, they were determined upon spiritualizing the world as much as possible, and, once the hymn was concluded, the father launched into one of those hackneyed descriptions of the delights of a release, via self-realization of the mercy of God and the love of Christ and the will of God towards sinners, from the burdensome cares of an evil conscience. "All men are sinners in the light of the Lord," he declared. "Unless they repent, unless they accept Christ, His love and forgiveness of them, they can never know the happiness of being spiritually whole and clean. Oh, my friends! If you could but know the peace and content that comes with the knowledge, the inward understanding, that Christ lived and died for you and that He walks with you every day and hour, by light and by dark, at dawn and at dusk, to keep and strengthen you for the tasks and cares of the world that are ever before you. Oh, the snares and pitfalls that beset us all! And then the soothing realization that Christ is ever with us, to counsel, to aid, to hearten, to bind up our wounds and make us whole. Oh, the peace, the satisfaction, the comfort, the glory of that! Amen." Asseverated his wife, and the daughter, Hester, or Esta, as she was called by the family, moved by the need of as much public support as possible for all of them, echoed it after her. Clyde, the eldest boy, and the two younger children merely gazed at the ground, or occasionally at their father, with a feeling that possibly it was all true and important, yet somehow not as significant or inviting as some of the other things which life held. They heard so much of this, and to their young and eager minds life was made for something more than street and mission hall protestations of this sort. Finally, after a second hymn and an address by Mrs. Griffiths, during which she took occasion to refer to the mission work jointly conducted by them in a nearby street, and their services to the cause of Christ in general, a third hymn was indulged in, and then some tracts describing the mission rescue work being distributed. Such voluntary gifts as were forthcoming were taken up by Asa the father. The small organ was closed, the camp chair folded up and given to Clyde, the Bible and hymn books picked up by Mrs. Griffiths, and with the organ supported by a leather strap passed over the shoulder of Griffiths, Sr., the missionward march was taken up. During all this time Clyde was saying to himself that he did not wish to do this any more, that he and his parents looked foolish and less than normal. Cheap was the word he would have used if he could have brought himself to express his full measure of resentment at being compelled to participate in this way, and that he would not do it any more if he could help. What good did it do them to have him along? His life should not be like this. Other boys did not have to do as he did. He meditated now more determinedly than ever a rebellion by which he would rid himself of the need of going out in this way. Let his elder sister go if she chose, she liked it. His younger sister and brother might be too young to care. But they seemed a little more attentive than usual tonight, I thought, commented Griffiths to his wife as they walked along, the seductive quality of the summer evening air softening him into a more generous interpretation of the customary indifferent spirit of the passer-by. Yes, 27 took tracks tonight as against 18 on Thursday. The love of Christ must eventually prevail, comforted the father, as much to hearten himself as his wife. The pleasures and cares of the world hold a very great many, but when sorrow overtakes them, then some of these seeds will take root. I am sure of it. That is the thought which always keeps me up. Sorrow and the weight of sin eventually bring some of them to see the error of their way. They now entered into the narrow side street from which they had emerged, and walking as many as a dozen doors from the corner, entered the door of a yellow single-story wooden building, the large window and the two glass panes in the central door of which had been painted a gray-white. Across both windows and the smaller panels in the double door had been painted, "The Door of Hope. Bethel Independent Mission. Meetings every Wednesday and Saturday night, 8 to 10. Sundays at 11, 3 and 8. Everybody welcome." Under this legend on each window were printed the words, "God is love," and below this again, in smaller type, "How long since you wrote to Mother?" The small company entered the yellow unprepossessing door and disappeared. Chapter 2. That such a family, thus cursorily presented, might have a different and somewhat peculiar history could well be anticipated, and it would be true. Indeed, this one presented one of those anomalies of psychic and social reflex and motivation such as would tax the skill of not only the psychologist but the chemist and physicist as well, to unravel. To begin with, Asa Griffiths, the father, was one of those poorly integrated and correlated organisms, the product of an environment and a religious theory, but with no guiding or mental insight of his own, yet sensitive and therefore highly emotional and without any practical sense whatsoever. Indeed, it would be hard to make clear just how life appealed to him, or what the true hue of his emotional responses was. On the other hand, as has been indicated, his wife was of a firmer texture but with scarcely any truer or more practical insight into anything. The history of this man and his wife is of no particular interest here save as it affected their boy of 12, Clyde Griffiths. This youth, aside from a certain emotionalism and exotic sense of romance which characterized him, and which he took more from his father than from his mother, brought a more vivid and intelligent imagination to things, and was constantly thinking of how he might better himself, if he had a chance, places to which he might go, things he might see, and how differently he might live, if only this, that and the other things were true. The principal thing that troubled Clyde up to his 15th year, and for long after in retrospect, was that the calling or profession of his parents was the shabby thing that it appeared to be in the eyes of others. For so often throughout his youth in different cities in which his parents had conducted a mission or spoken on the streets, Grand Rapids, Detroit, Milwaukee, Chicago, lastly Kansas City, it had been obvious that people, at least the boys and girls he encountered, looked down upon him and his brothers and sisters for being the children of such parents. On several occasions, and much against the mood of his parents, who never countenanced such exhibitions of temper, he had stopped to fight with one or another of these boys. But always, beaten or victorious, he had been conscious of the fact that the work his parents did was not satisfactory to others, shabby, trivial. And always he was thinking of what he would do, once he reached the place where he could get away. For Clyde's parents had proved impractical in the matter of the future of their children. They did not understand the importance or the essential necessity for some form of practical or professional training for each and every one of their young ones. Instead, being wrapped up in the notion of evangelizing the world, they had neglected to keep their children in school in any one place. They had moved here and there, sometimes in the very midst of an advantageous school season, because of a larger and better religious field in which to work. And there were times, when, the work proving highly unprofitable and Asa being unable to make much money at the two things he most understood, gardening and canvassing for one invention or another. They were quite without sufficient food or decent clothes, and the children could not go to school. In the face of such situations as these, whatever the children might think, Asa and his wife remained as optimistic as ever, or they insisted to themselves that they were, and had unwavering faith in the Lord and his intention to provide. The combination home and mission which this family occupied was dreary enough in most of its phases to discourage the average youth or girl of any spirit. It consisted in its entirety of one long store floor in an old and decidedly colorless and inartistic wooden building which was situated in that part of Kansas City which lies north of Independence Boulevard and west of Troost Avenue, the exact street or place being called Bickle, a very short thoroughfare opening off Missouri Avenue, a somewhat more lengthy but no less nondescript highway. And the entire neighborhood in which it stood was very faintly and yet not agreeably redolent of a commercial life which had long since moved farther south, if not west. It was some 5 blocks from the spot on which twice a week the open-air meetings of these religious enthusiasts and proselytizers were held. And it was the ground floor of this building, looking out into Bickle Street at the front and some dreary backyards of equally dreary frame houses, which was divided at the front into a hall 40 by 25 feet in size, in which had been placed some 60 collapsible wood chairs, a lectern, a map of Palestine or the Holy Land, and for wall decorations some 25 printed but unframed mottos which read in part, "Wine is a mocker, strong drink is raging, and whosoever is deceived thereby is not wise. Take hold of shield and buckler, and stand up for mine help." Psalms 35:2. "And ye, my flock, the flock of my pasture, are men, and I am your God, saith the Lord God." Ezekiel 34:31. "O God, thou knowest my foolishness, and my sins are not hid from thee." Psalms 69:5. "If ye have faith as a grain of mustard seed, ye shall say unto this mountain, Remove hence to yonder place, and it shall move, and nothing shall be impossible to you." Matthew 17:20. "For the day of the Lord is near." Obadiah 15. "For there shall be no reward to the evil man." Proverbs 24:20. "Look, then, not upon the wine when it is red, it beateth like a serpent, and stingeth like an adder." Proverbs 23:31-32. These mighty adjurations were as silver and gold plates set in a wall of dross. The rear 40 feet of this very commonplace floor was intricately and yet neatly divided into 3 small bedrooms, a living room which overlooked the backyard and wooden fences of yards no better than those at the back, also, a combination kitchen and dining room exactly 10 feet square, and a storeroom for mission tracts, hymnals, boxes, trunks and whatever else of non-immediate use, but of assumed value, which the family owned. This particular small room lay immediately to the rear of the mission hall itself, and into it before or after speaking or at such times as a conference seemed important, both Mr. and Mrs. Griffiths were wont to retire, also at times to meditate or pray. How often had Clyde and his sisters and younger brother seen his mother or father, or both, in conference with some derelict or semi-repentant soul who had come for advice or aid, most usually for aid. And here at times, when his mother's and father's financial difficulties were greatest, they were to be found thinking, or as Asa Griffiths was wont helplessly to say at times, praying their way out, a rather ineffectual way, as Clyde began to think later. And the whole neighborhood was so dreary and run down that he hated the thought of living in it, let alone being part of a work that required constant appeals for aid, as well as constant prayer and thanksgiving to sustain it. Mrs. Elvira Griffiths before she had married Asa had been nothing but an ignorant farm girl, brought up without much thought of religion of any kind. But having fallen in love with him, she had become inoculated with the virus of evangelism and proselytizing which dominated him, and had followed him gladly and enthusiastically in all of his ventures and through all of his vagaries. Being rather flattered by the knowledge that she could speak and sing, her ability to sway and persuade and control people with the Word of God, as she saw it, She had become more or less pleased with herself on this account and so persuaded to continue. Occasionally a small band of people followed the preachers to their mission, or learning of its existence through their street work, appeared there later, those odd and mentally disturbed or distray souls who are to be found in every place. And it had been Clyde's compulsory duty throughout the years when he could not act for himself to be in attendance at these various meetings. And always he had been more irritated than favorably influenced by the types of men and women who came here, mostly men, down and out laborers, loafers, drunkards, wastrels, debauched and helpless who seemed to drift in, because they had no other place to go. And they were always testifying as to how God or Christ or divine grace had rescued them from this or that predicament, never how they had rescued anyone else. And always his father and mother were saying Amen and glory to God, and singing hymns and afterward taking up a collection for the legitimate expenses of the hall, collections which, as he surmised, were little enough, barely enough to keep the various missions they had conducted in existence. The one thing that really interested him in connection with his parents was the existence somewhere in the east, in a small city called Lycurgus, near Utica. He understood, of an uncle, a brother of his father's, who was plainly different from all this. That uncle, Samuel Griffiths by name, was rich. In one way and another, from casual remarks dropped by his parents, Clyde had heard references to certain things this particular uncle might do for a person, if he but would, references to the fact that he was a shrewd, hard businessman, that he had a great house and a large factory in Lycurgus for the manufacture of collars and shirts, which employed not less than 300 people, that he had a son who must be about Clyde's age, and several daughters, 2 at least, all of whom must be, as Clyde imagined, living in luxury in Lycurgus. News of all this had apparently been brought west in some way by people who knew Asa and his father and brother. As Clyde pictured this uncle, he must be a kind of Croesus, living in ease and luxury there in the east, while here in the west, Kansas City, he and his parents and his brother and sisters were living in the same wretched and humdrum, hand-to-mouth state that had always characterized their lives. But for this, apart from anything he might do for himself, as he early began to see, there was no remedy. For at 15, and even a little earlier, Clyde began to understand that his education, as well as his sisters and brothers, had been sadly neglected. And it would be rather hard for him to overcome this handicap, seeing that other boys and girls with more money and better homes were being trained for special kinds of work. How was one to get a start under such circumstances? Already when, at the age of 13, 14 and 15, he began looking in the papers, which, being too worldly, had never been admitted to his home, he found that mostly skilled help was wanted, or boys to learn trades in which at the moment he was not very much interested. For true to the standard of the American youth, or the general American attitude toward life, he felt himself above the type of labor which was purely manual. What? Run a machine, lay bricks, learn to be a carpenter, or a plasterer, or a plumber, when boys no better than himself were clerks and druggists' assistants and bookkeepers and assistants in banks and real estate offices and such. Wasn't it menial, as miserable as the life he had thus far been leading, to wear old clothes and get up so early in the morning and do all the commonplace things such people had to do? For Clyde was as vain and proud as he was poor. He was one of those interesting individuals who looked upon himself as a thing apart, never quite wholly and indissolubly merged with the family of which he was a member, and never with any profound obligations to those who had been responsible for his coming into the world. On the contrary, he was inclined to study his parents, not too sharply or bitterly, but with a very fair grasp of their qualities and capabilities. And yet, with so much judgment in that direction, he was never quite able, at least not until he had reached his 16th year, to formulate any policy in regard to himself, and then only in a rather fumbling and tentative way. Incidentally, by that time the sex lure or appeal had begun to manifest itself, and he was already intensely interested and troubled by the beauty of the opposite sex, its attractions for him and his attraction for it. And, naturally and coincidentally, the matter of his clothes and his physical appearance had begun to trouble him not a little, how he looked and how other boys looked. It was painful to him now to think that his clothes were not right, that he was not as handsome as he might be, not as interesting. What a wretched thing it was to be born poor and not to have anyone to do anything for you and not to be able to do so very much for yourself. Casual examination of himself in mirrors whenever he found them tended rather to assure him that he was not so bad looking, a straight, well-cut nose, high white forehead, wavy, glossy, black hair, eyes that were black and rather melancholy at times. And yet the fact that his family was the unhappy thing that it was, that he had never had any real friends, and could not have any, as he saw it, because of the work and connection of his parents, was now tending more and more to induce a kind of mental depression or melancholia which promised not so well for his future. It served to make him rebellious and hence lethargic at times. Because of his parents, and in spite of his looks, which were really agreeable and more appealing than most, he was inclined to misinterpret the interested looks which were cast at him occasionally by young girls in very different walks of life from him, the contemptuous and yet rather inviting way in which they looked to see if he were interested or disinterested, brave or cowardly. And yet, before he had ever earned any money at all, he had always told himself that if only he had a better collar, a nicer shirt, finer shoes, a good suit, a swell overcoat like some boys had. Oh, the fine clothes, the handsome homes, the watches, rings, pins that some boys sported, the dandies many youths of his years already were. Some parents of boys of his years actually gave them cars of their own to ride in. They were to be seen upon the principal streets of Kansas City flitting to and fro like flies. And pretty girls with them. And he had nothing. And he never had had. And yet the world was so full of so many things to do, so many people were so happy and so successful. What was he to do? Which way to turn? What one thing to take up and master, something that would get him somewhere? He could not say. He did not know exactly. And these peculiar parents were in no way sufficiently equipped to advise him. Chapter 3. One of the things that served to darken Clyde's mood just about the time when he was seeking some practical solution for himself, to say nothing of its profoundly disheartening effect on the Griffiths family as a whole, was the fact that his sister Esther, in whom he took no little interest, although they really had very little in common, ran away from home with an actor who happened to be playing in Kansas City and who took a passing fancy for her. The truth in regard to Esther was that in spite of her guarded upbringing, and the seeming religious and moral fervor which at times appeared to characterize her, she was just a sensuous, weak girl who did not by any means know yet what she thought. Despite the atmosphere in which she moved, essentially she was not of it. Like the large majority of those who profess and daily repeat the dogmas and creeds of the world, she had come into her practices and imagined attitudes so insensibly from her earliest childhood on, that up to this time, and even later, she did not know the meaning of it all. For the necessity of thought had been obviated by advice and law, or revealed truth, and so long as other theories or situations and impulses of an external or even internal character did not arise to clash with these, she was safe enough. Once they did, however, it was a foregone conclusion that her religious notions, not being grounded on any conviction or temperamental bias of her own, were not likely to withstand the shock. So that all the while, and not unlike her brother Clyde, her thoughts as well as her emotions were wandering here and there, to love, to comfort, to things which in the main had little, if anything, to do with any self-abnegating and self-immolating religious theory. Within her was a chemism of dreams which somehow counteracted all they had to say. Yet she had neither Clyde's force, nor, on the other hand, his resistance. She was in the main a drifter, with a vague yearning toward pretty dresses, hats, shoes, ribbons and the like, and superimposed above this, the religious theory or notion that she should not be. There were the long bright streets of a morning and afternoon after school or of an evening. The charm of certain girls swinging along together, arms locked, secrets whispering, or that of boys, clownish, yet revealing through their bounding ridiculous animality the force and meaning of that chemistry and urge toward mating which lies back of all youthful thought and action. And in herself, as from time to time she observed lovers or flirtation seekers who lingered at street corners or about doorways, and who looked at her in a longing and seeking way, there was a stirring, unnerved pleasant palpitation that spoke loudly for all the seemingly material things of life, not for the thin pleasantries of heaven. And the glances drilled her like an invisible ray, for she was pleasing to look at and was growing more attractive hourly. And the moods in others awakened responsive moods in her, those rearranging chemisms upon which all the morality or immorality of the world is based. And then one day, as she was coming home from school, a youth of that plausible variety known as masher engaged her in conversation, largely because of a look and a mood which seemed to invite it. And there was little to stay her, for she was essentially yielding, if not amorous. Yet so great had been her home drilling as to the need of modesty, circumspection, purity and the like, that on this occasion at least there was no danger of any immediate lapse. Only this attack once made, others followed, were accepted, or not so quickly fled from, and by degrees, these served to break down that wall of reserve which her home training had served to erect. She became secretive and hid her ways from her parents. Youths occasionally walked and talked with her in spite of herself. They demolished that excessive shyness which had been hers, and which had served to put others aside for a time at least. She wished for other contacts, dreamed of some bright, gay, wonderful love of some kind, with someone. Finally, after a slow but vigorous internal growth of mood and desire, there came this actor, one of those vain, handsome, animal personalities, all clothes and airs, but no morals, no taste, no courtesy or real tenderness even, but of compelling magnetism, who was able within the space of one brief week and a few meetings to completely befuddle and enmesh her so that she was really his to do with as he wished. And the truth was that he scarcely cared for her at all. To him, dull as he was, she was just another girl, fairly pretty, obviously sensuous and inexperienced, a silly who could be taken by a few soft words, a show of seemingly sincere affection, talk of the opportunity of a broader, freer life on the road, in other great cities, as his wife. And yet his words were those of a lover who would be true forever. All she had to do, as he explained to her, was to come away with him and be his bride, at once, now. Delay was so vain when two such as they had met. There was difficulty about marriage here, which he could not explain. It related to friends, but in St. Louis he had a preacher friend who would wed them. She was to have new and better clothes than she had ever known, delicious adventures, love. She would travel with him and see the great world. She would never need to trouble more about anything save him, and while it was truth to her, the verbal surety of a genuine passion, to him it was the most ancient and serviceable type of blarney, often used before and often successful. In a single week then, at odd hours, morning, afternoon and night, this chemic witchery was accomplished. Coming home rather late one Saturday night in April from a walk which he had taken about the business heart, in order to escape the regular Saturday night mission services, Clyde found his mother and father worried about the whereabouts of Esta. She had played and sung as usual at this meeting. And all had seemed all right with her. After the meeting she had gone to her room, saying that she was not feeling very well and was going to bed early. But by 11 o'clock, when Clyde returned, her mother had chanced to look into her room and discovered that she was not there nor anywhere about the place. A certain bareness in connection with the room, some trinkets and dresses removed, an old and familiar suitcase gone, had first attracted her mother's attention. Then the house search proving that she was not there, Asa had gone outside to look up and down the street. She sometimes walked out alone, or sat or stood in front of the mission during its idle or closed hours. This search revealing nothing, Clyde and he had walked to a corner, then along Missouri Avenue. No Esta. At 12 they returned, and after that, naturally, the curiosity in regard to her grew momentarily sharper. At first they assumed that she might have taken an unexplained walk somewhere, but as 12:30, And finally 1:30 passed, and no ESTA. They were about to notify the police, when Clyde, going into her room, saw a note pinned to the pillow of her small wooden bed, a missive that had escaped the eye of his mother. At once he went to it, curious and comprehending, for he had often wondered in what way, assuming that he ever wished to depart surreptitiously, he would notify his parents, for he knew they would never countenance his departure unless they were permitted to supervise it in every detail. And now here was Esta missing, and here was undoubtedly some such communication as he might have left. He picked it up, eager to read it, but at that moment his mother came into the room and, seeing it in his hand, exclaimed, "What's that? A note? Is it from her?" He surrendered it and she unfolded it, reading it quickly. He noted that her strong broad face, always tanned a reddish brown, blanched as she turned away toward the outer room. Her biggish mouth was now set in a firm, straight line. Her large, strong hand shook the least bit as it held the small note aloft. "Asa," she called, and then tramping into the next room where he was, his frizzled grayish hair curling distractedly above his round head, she said, "Read this." Clyde, who had followed, saw him take it a little nervously in his pudgy hands, his lips, always weak and beginning to crinkle at the center with age, now working curiously. Anyone who had known his life's history would have said it was the expression, slightly emphasized, with which he had received most of the untoward blows of his life in the past. "TST. TST. TST," was the only sound he made at first, a sucking sound of the tongue and palate, most weak and inadequate, it seemed to Clyde. Next there was another TST. TST. TST, his head beginning to shake from side to side. Then, now, what do you suppose could have caused her to do that? Then he turned and gazed at his wife, who gazed blankly in return. Then, walking to and fro, his hands behind him, his short legs taking unconscious and queerly long steps, his head moving again, he gave vent to another ineffectual TST. 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 Always the more impressive, Mrs. Griffiths now showed herself markedly different and more vital in this trying situation, a kind of irritation or dissatisfaction with life itself, along with an obvious physical distress, seeming to pass through her like a visible shadow. Once her husband had gotten up, she reached out and took the note, then merely glared at it again, her face set in hard yet stricken and disturbing lines. Her manner was that of one who is intensely disquieted and dissatisfied, one who fingers savagely at a material knot and yet cannot undo it, one who seeks restraint and freedom from complaint and yet who would complain bitterly, angrily. For behind her were all those years of religious work and faith, which somehow, in her poorly integrated conscience, seemed dimly to indicate that she should justly have been spared this. Where was her God, her Christ, at this hour when this obvious evil was being done? Why had he not acted for her? How was he to explain this? His biblical promises. His perpetual guidance. His declared mercies. In the face of so great a calamity, it was very hard for her, as Clyde could see, to get this straightened out, instantly at least. Although, as Clyde had come to know, it could be done eventually, of course. For in some blind, dualistic way both she and Asa insisted, as do all religionists, in disassociating God from harm and error and misery, while granting him nevertheless supreme control. They would seek for something else, some malign, treacherous, deceiving power which, in the face of God's omniscience and omnipotence, still beguiles and betrays, and find it eventually in the error and perverseness of the human heart, which God has made, yet which he does not control, because he does not want to control it. At the moment, however, only hurt and rage were with her, and yet her lips did not twitch as did Asa's, nor did her eyes show that profound distress which filled his. Instead she retreated a step and re-examined the letter, almost angrily, then said to Asa, "She's run away with someone and she doesn't say." Then she stopped suddenly, remembering the presence of the children, Clyde, Julia, and Frank, all present and all gazing curiously, intently, unbelievingly. "Come in here," she called to her husband. "I want to talk to you a minute. You children had better go on to bed. We'll be out in a minute." With ASA then she retired quite precipitately to a small room back of the mission hall. They heard her click the electric bulb. Then their voices were heard in low converse, while Clyde and Julia and Frank looked at each other, although Frank, being so young, only 10, could scarcely be said to have comprehended fully. Even Julia hardly gathered the full import of it. But Clyde, because of his larger contact with life and his mother's statement, "She's run away with someone," understood well enough. Esta had tired of all this, as had he. Perhaps there was someone, like one of those dandies whom he saw on the streets with the prettiest girls, with whom she had gone. But where? And what was he like? That note told something, and yet his mother had not let him see it. She had taken it away too quickly. If only he had looked first, silently unto himself. "Do you suppose she's run away for good?" he asked Julia dubiously, the while his parents were out of the room, Julia herself looking so blank and strange. "How should I know?" she replied a little irritably, troubled by her parents' distress and this secretiveness, as well as Esta's action. "She never said anything to me. I should think she'd be ashamed of herself if she has." Julia, being colder emotionally than either Esta or Clyde, was more considerate of her parents in a conventional way, and hence sorrier. True, she did not quite gather what it meant, but she suspected something, for she had talked occasionally with girls, but in a very guarded and conservative way. Now, however, it was more the way in which Esta had chosen to leave, deserting her parents and her brothers and herself, that caused her to be angry with her. For why should she go and do anything which would distress her parents in this dreadful fashion? It was dreadful. The air was thick with misery. And as his parents talked in their little room, Clyde brooded too, for he was intensely curious about life now. What was it Esta had really done? Was it, as he feared and thought, one of those dreadful runaway or sexually disagreeable affairs which the boys on the streets and at school were always slyly talking about? How shameful, if that were true. She might never come back. She had gone with some man. There was something wrong about that, no doubt, for a girl, anyhow, for all he had ever heard was that all decent contacts between boys and girls, men and women, led to but one thing, marriage. And now Esta, in addition to their other troubles, had gone and done this. Certainly this home life of theirs was pretty dark now. And it would be darker instead of brighter because of this. Presently the parents came out, and then Mrs. Griffith's face, if still set and constrained, was somehow a little different, less savage perhaps, more hopelessly resigned. "Esta's seen fit to leave us, for a little while, anyhow," was all she said at first, seeing the children waiting curiously. "Now, you're not to worry about her at all, or think any more about it. She'll come back after a while, I'm sure. She has chosen to go her own way, for a time, for some reason. The Lord's will be done. Blessed be the name of the Lord." Interpolated ASA, "I thought she was happy here with us, but apparently she wasn't. She must see something of the world for herself, I suppose." Here ASA put in another TST. TST, but we mustn't harbor hard thoughts. That won't do any good now, only thoughts of love and kindness. Yet she said this with a kind of sternness that somehow belied it, a click of the voice, as it were. "We can only hope that she will soon see how foolish she has been, and unthinking, and come back. She can't prosper on the course she's going now. It isn't the Lord's way or will. She's too young and she's made a mistake. But we can forgive her. We must. Our hearts must be kept open, soft and tender." She talked as though she were addressing a meeting, but with a hard, sad, frozen face and voice. "Now, all of you go to bed. We can only pray now, and hope, morning, noon and night, that no evil will befall her. I wish she hadn't done that," she added, quite out of keeping with the rest of her statement and really not thinking of the children as present at all, just of Esta. But ASA? Such a father, as Clyde often thought, afterwards, Apart from his own misery, he seemed only to note and be impressed by the more significant misery of his wife. During all this, he had stood foolishly to one side, short, gray, frizzled, inadequate. "Well, blessed be the name of the Lord," he interpolated from time to time. "We must keep our hearts open. Yes, we mustn't judge. We must only hope for the best. Yes, yes. Praise the Lord, we must praise the Lord. Amen. Oh, yes. TST. 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 If anyone asks where she is," continued Mrs. Griffiths after a time, quite ignoring her spouse and addressing the children, who had drawn near her, "we will say that she has gone on a visit to some of my relatives back in Tonawanda. That won't be the truth, exactly, but then we don't know where she is or what the truth is, and she may come back. So we must not say or do anything that will injure her until we know." "Yes, praise the Lord," called Asa, feebly. "So if anyone should inquire at any time, until we know, we will say that." "Sure," put in Clyde, helpfully, and Julia added, "All right." Mrs. Griffiths paused and looked firmly and yet apologetically at her children. Asa, for his part, emitted another TST. 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 And then the children were waved to bed. At that, Clyde, who really wanted to know what Esta's letter had said, but was convinced from long experience that his mother would not let him know unless she chose, returned to his room again, for he was tired. Why didn't they search more if there was hope of finding her? Where was she now, at this minute? On some train somewhere? Evidently she didn't want to be found. She was probably dissatisfied, just as he was. Here he was, thinking so recently of going away somewhere himself, wondering how the family would take it, and now she had gone before him. How would that affect his point of view and action in the future? Truly, in spite of his father's and mother's misery, he could not see that her going was such a calamity, not from the going point of view, at any rate. It was only another something which hinted that things were not right here. Mission work was nothing. All this religious emotion and talk was not so much either. It hadn't saved Esta. Evidently, like himself, she didn't believe so much in it, either. Chapter 4. The effect of this particular conclusion was to cause Clyde to think harder than ever about himself. And the principal result of his thinking was that he must do something for himself and soon. Up to this time the best he had been able to do was to work at such odd jobs as befall all boys between their 12th and 15th years, assisting a man who had a paper route during the summer months of 1 year, working in the basement of a 5 and 10-cent store all one summer long, and on Saturdays, for a period during the winter, opening boxes and unpacking goods, for which he received the munificent sum of $5 a week, a sum which at the time seemed almost a fortune. He felt himself rich and, in the face of the opposition of his parents, who were opposed to the theater and motion pictures also, as being not only worldly, but sinful, he could occasionally go to one or another of those, in the gallery, a form of diversion which he had to conceal from his parents. Yet that did not deter him. He felt that he had a right to go with his own money, also to take his younger brother Frank, who was glad enough to go with him and say nothing. Later in the same year, wishing to get out of school because he already felt himself very much belated in the race, he secured a place as an assistant to a soda water clerk in one of the cheaper drug stores of the city, which adjoined a theater and enjoyed not a little patronage of this sort. A sign, "Boy Wanted," since it was directly on his way to school, first interested him. Later, in conversation with the young man whose assistant he was to be, and from whom he was to learn the trade, assuming that he was sufficiently willing and facile, he gathered that if he mastered this art, he might make as much as $15 and even $18 a week. It was rumored that Stroud's at the corner of 14th and Baltimore Streets paid that much to two of their clerks. The particular store to which he was applying paid only $12, the standard salary of most places. But to acquire this art, as he was now informed, required time and the friendly help of an expert. If he wished to come here and work for $5 to begin with, well, $6, then, Since his face fell, he might soon expect to know a great deal about the art of mixing sweet drinks and decorating a large variety of ice creams with liquid sweets, thus turning them into sundaes. For the time being, apprenticeship meant washing and polishing all the machinery and implements of this particular counter, to say nothing of opening and sweeping out the store at so early an hour as 7:30, dusting, and delivering such orders as the owner of this drug store chose to send out by him. At such idle moments as his immediate superior, a Mr. C. Burling, 20, dashing, self-confident, talkative, was too busy to fill all the orders, he might be called upon to mix such minor drinks, lemonades, Coca-Colas and the like, as the trade demanded. Yet this interesting position, after due consultation with his mother, he decided to take. For one thing, it would provide him, as he suspected, with all the ice cream sodas he desired, free, an advantage not to be disregarded. In the next place, as he saw it at the time, it was an open door to a trade, something which he lacked. Further, and not at all disadvantageously as he saw it, this store required his presence at night as late as 12 o'clock, with certain hours off during the day to compensate for this. And this took him out of his home at night, out of the 10 o'clock boy class at last. They could not ask him to attend any meetings save on Sunday, and not even then, since he was supposed to work Sunday afternoons and evenings. Next, the clerk who manipulated this particular soda fountain, quite regularly received passes from the manager of the theater next door, and into the lobby of which one door to the drug store gave, a most fascinating connection to Clyde. It seemed so interesting to be working for a drug store thus intimately connected with a theater. And best of all, as Clyde now found to his pleasure, and yet despair at times, the place was visited, just before and after the show on matinee days, by bevies of girls, single and unsweet, who sat at the counter and giggled and chattered and gave their hair and their complexions last perfecting touches before the mirror. And Clyde, callow and inexperienced in the ways of the world, and those of the opposite sex, was never weary of observing the beauty, the daring, the self-sufficiency and the sweetness of these, as he saw them. For the first time in his life, while he busied himself with washing glasses, filling the ice cream and syrup containers, arranging the lemons and oranges in the trays, he had an almost uninterrupted opportunity of studying these girls at close range. The wonder of them. For the most part, they were so well dressed and smart-looking, the rings, pins, furs, delightful hats, pretty shoes they wore. And so often he overheard them discussing such interesting things, parties, dances, dinners, the shows they had seen, the places in or near Kansas City to which they were soon going, the difference between the styles of this year and last, the fascination of certain actors and actresses, principally actors, who were now playing or soon coming to the city. And to this day, in his own home he had heard nothing of all this. And very often one or another of these young beauties was accompanied by some male in evening suit, dress shirt, high hat, bow tie, white kid gloves and patent leather shoes, a costume which at that time Clyde felt to be the last word in all true distinction, beauty, gallantry and bliss. To be able to wear such a suit with such ease and air. To be able to talk to a girl after the manner and with the sang-froid of some of these gallants. What a true measure of achievement. No good-looking girl, as it then appeared to him, would have anything to do with him if he did not possess this standard of equipment. It was plainly necessary, the thing. And once he did attain it, was able to wear such clothes as these, well, then was he not well set upon the path that leads to all the blisses? All the joys of life would then most certainly be spread before him. The friendly smiles. The secret hand clasps, maybe, an arm about the waist of someone or another, a kiss, a promise of marriage, and then. And all this as a revealing flash after all the years of walking through the streets with his father and mother to public prayer meeting, the sitting in chapel and listening to queer and nondescript individuals, depressing and disconcerting people, telling how Christ had saved them and what God had done for them. You bet he would get out of that now. He would work and save his money and be somebody. Decidedly this simple and yet idyllic compound of the commonplace had all the luster and wonder of a spiritual transfiguration, the true mirage of the lost and thirsting and seeking victim of the desert. However, the trouble with this particular position, as time speedily proved, was that much as it might teach him of mixing drinks and how to eventually earn $12 a week, it was no immediate solvent for the yearnings and ambitions that were already gnawing at his vitals. For Albert Sieberling, his immediate superior, was determined to keep as much of his knowledge, as well as the most pleasant parts of the tasks, to himself. And further, he was quite at one with the druggist for whom they worked in thinking that Clyde, in addition to assisting him about the fountain, should run such errands as the druggist desired, which kept Clyde industriously employed for nearly all the hours he was on duty. Consequently, there was no immediate result to all this. Clyde could see no way to dressing better than he did. Worse, he was haunted by the fact that he had very little money and very few contacts and connections, so few that, outside his own home, he was lonely and not so very much less than lonely there. The flight of Esta had thrown a chill over the religious work there, and because, as yet, she had not returned, the family, as he now heard, was thinking of breaking up here and moving, for want of a better idea, to Denver, Colorado. But Clyde, by now, was convinced that he did not wish to accompany them. What was the good of it, he asked himself. There would be just another mission there, the same as this one. He had always lived at home, in the rooms at the rear of the mission in Bickle Street, but he hated it. And since his 11th year, during all of which time his family had been residing in Kansas City, he had been ashamed to bring boy friends to or near it. For that reason he had always avoided boy friends, and had walked and played very much alone, or with his brother and sisters. But now that he was 16 and old enough to make his own way, he ought to be getting out of this. And yet he was earning almost nothing, not enough to live on, if he were alone, and he had not as yet developed sufficient skill or courage to get anything better. Nevertheless, when his parents began to talk of moving to Denver, and suggested that he might secure work out there, never assuming for a moment that he would not want to go, he began to throw out hints to the effect that it might be better if he did not. He liked Kansas City. What was the use of changing? He had a job now and he might get something better. But his parents, bethinking themselves of Esta and the fate that had overtaken her, were not a little dubious as to the outcome of such early adventuring on his part alone. Once they were away, where would he live? With whom? What sort of influence would enter his life, who would be at hand to aid and counsel and guide him in the straight and narrow path, as they had done? It was something to think about. But spurred by this imminence of Denver, which now daily seemed to be drawing nearer, and the fact that not long after this Mr. Sieberling, owing to his too obvious gallantries in connection with the fair sex, lost his place in the drugstore, and Clyde came by a new and bony and chill superior who did not seem to want him as an assistant, he decided to quit, not at once, but rather to see, on such errands as took him out of the store, if he could not find something else. Incidentally, in so doing, looking here and there, he one day thought he would speak to the manager of the fountain, which was connected with the leading drugstore in the principal hotel of the city, the latter a great 12-story affair, which represented, as he saw it, the quintessence of luxury and ease. Its windows were always so heavily curtained, the main entrance, he had never ventured to look beyond that, was a splendiferous combination of a glass and iron awning, coupled with a marble corridor lined with palms. Often he had passed here, wondering with boyish curiosity what the nature of the life of such a place might be. Before its doors, so many taxis and automobiles were always in waiting. Today, being driven by the necessity of doing something for himself, he entered the drugstore, which occupied the principal corner, facing 14th Street at Baltimore, and finding a girl cashier in a small glass cage near the door, asked of her who was in charge of the soda fountain. Interested by his tentative and uncertain manner, as well as his deep and rather appealing eyes, and instinctively judging that he was looking for something to do, she observed, "Why, Mr. Secker, there, the manager of the store." She nodded in the direction of a short, meticulously dressed man of about 35, who was arranging an special display of toilet novelties on the top of a glass case. Clyde approached him, and being still very dubious as to how one went about getting anything in life, and finding him engrossed in what he was doing, stood first on one foot and then on the other, until at last, sensing someone was hovering about for something, the man turned. "Well?" he queried. "You don't happen to need a soda fountain helper, do you?" Clyde cast at him a glance that said as plain as anything could, "If you have any such place, I wish you would please give it to me. I need it." "No, no, no," replied this individual, who was blond and vigorous and by nature a little irritable and contentious. He was about to turn away, but seeing a flicker of disappointment and depression pass over Clyde's face, he turned and added, "Ever work in a place like this before?" "No place as fine as this." "No, sir," replied Clyde, rather fancifully moved by all that was about him. "I'm working now down at Mr. Klinkle's store at 7th and Brooklyn, but it isn't anything like this one and I'd like to get something better if I could." Went on his interviewer, rather pleased by the innocent tribute to the superiority of his store. "Well, that's reasonable enough. But there isn't anything here right now that I could offer you. We don't make many changes. But if you'd like to be a bellboy, I can tell you where you might get a place. They're looking for an extra boy in the hotel inside there right now. The captain of the boys was telling me he was in need of one. I should think that would be as good as helping about a soda fountain, any day." Then seeing Clyde's face suddenly brighten, he added, "But you mustn't say that I sent you, because I don't know you. Just ask for Mr. Squires inside there, under the stairs, and he can tell you all about it." At the mere mention of work in connection with so imposing an institution as the Green Davidson, and the possibility of his getting it, Clyde first stared, felt himself tremble the least bit with excitement, then thanking his advisor for his kindness, went direct to a green marbled doorway which opened from the rear of this drugstore into the lobby of the hotel. Once through it, he beheld a lobby, the like of which, for all his years but because of the timorous poverty that had restrained him from exploring such a world, was more arresting, quite, than anything he had seen before. It was also lavish. Under his feet was a checkered black and white marble floor. Above him a coppered and stained and gilded ceiling. And supporting this, a veritable forest of black marble columns as highly polished as the floor, glassy smooth. And between the columns which ranged away toward 3 separate entrances, one right, one left and one directly forward toward Dalrymple Avenue, were lamps, statuary, rugs, palms, chairs, divans, tête-à-tête, a prodigal display. In short, it was compact, of all that gauche luxury of appointment which, as someone once sarcastically remarked, was intended to supply exclusiveness to the masses. Indeed, for an essential hotel in a great and successful American commercial city, it was almost too luxurious. Its rooms and hall and lobbies and restaurants were entirely too richly furnished, without the saving grace of either simplicity or necessity. As Clyde stood, gazing about the lobby, he saw a large company of people, some women and children, but principally men as he could see, either walking or standing about and talking or idling in the chairs, side by side or alone. And in heavily draped and richly furnished alcoves where were writing tables, newspaper files, a telegraph office, a haberdasher's shop, and a florist's stand, were other groups. There was a convention of dentists in the city, not a few of whom, with their wives and children, were gathered here, but to Clyde, who was not aware of this nor of the methods and meanings of conventions, this was the ordinary, everyday appearance of this hotel. He gazed about in awe and amazement, then remembering the name of Squires, he began to look for him in his office under the stairs. To his right was a grand double-winged black and white staircase which swung in 2 separate flights and with wide, generous curves from the main floor to the one above. And between these great flights was evidently the office of the hotel, for there were many clerks there. But behind the nearest flight, and close to the wall through which he had come, was a tall desk, at which stood a young man of about his own age in a maroon uniform bright with many brass buttons. And on his head was a small, round, pillbox cap, which was cocked jauntily over one ear. He was busy making entries with a lead pencil in a book which lay open before him. Various other boys about his own age, and uniformed as he was, were seated upon a long bench near him, or were to be seen darting here and there, sometimes, returning to this one with a slip of paper or a key or note of some kind, and then seating themselves upon the bench to await another call apparently, which seemed to come swiftly enough. A telephone upon the small desk at which stood the uniformed youth was almost constantly buzzing, and after ascertaining what was wanted, this youth struck a small bell before him, or called front, to which the first boy on the bench responded. Once called, they went hurrying up one or the other stairs or toward one of the several entrances or elevators, and almost invariably were to be seen escorting individuals whose bags and suitcases and overcoats and golf sticks they carried. There were others who disappeared and returned, carrying drinks on trays or some package or other, which they were taking to one of the rooms above. Plainly this was the work that he should be called upon to do, assuming that he would be so fortunate as to connect himself with such an institution as this. And it was all so brisk and enlivening that he wished that he might be so fortunate as to secure a position here. But would he be? And where was Mr. Squires? He approached the youth at the small desk. "Do you know where I will find Mr. Squires?" he asked. "Here he comes now," replied the youth, looking up and examining Clyde with keen, gray eyes. Clyde gazed in the direction indicated, and saw approaching a brisk and dapper and decidedly sophisticated-looking person of perhaps 29 or 30 years of age. He was so very slender, keen, hatchet-faced and well-dressed that Clyde was not only impressed but overawed at once, a very shrewd and cunning-looking person. His nose was so long and thin, his eyes so sharp, his lips thin, and chin pointed. "Did you see that tall, gray-haired man with the Scotch plaid shawl who went through here just now?" he paused to say to his assistant at the desk. The assistant nodded. "Well, they tell me that's the Earl of Landrell. He just came in this morning with 14 trunks and 4 servants. Can you beat it? He's somebody in Scotland. That isn't the name he travels under, though, I hear. He's registered as Mr. Blunt. Can you beat that English stuff? They can certainly lay on the class, eh?" "You said it," replied his assistant deferentially. He turned for the first time, glimpsing Clyde, but paying no attention to him. His assistant came to Clyde's aid. "That young fella there is waiting to see you," he explained. "You want to see me?" queried the captain of the bellhops, turning to Clyde, and observing his none too good clothes, at the same time making a comprehensive study of him. "The gentleman in the drugstore," began Clyde, who did not quite like the looks of the man before him, but was determined to present himself as agreeably as possible, was saying, "That is, he said that I might ask you if there was any chance here for me as a bellboy. I'm working now at Klinkle's drugstore at 7th and Brooklyn, as a helper, but I'd like to get out of that, and he said you might, that is, he thought you had a place open now." Clyde was so flustered and disturbed by the cool, examining eyes of the man before him that he could scarcely get his breath properly, and swallowed hard. For the first time in his life, it occurred to him that if he wanted to get on he ought to insinuate himself into the good graces of people, do or say something that would make them like him. So now he contrived an eager, ingratiating smile, which he bestowed on Mr. Squires, and added, "If you'd like to give me a chance, I'd try very hard and I'd be very willing." The man before him merely looked at him coldly, but being the soul of craft and self-acquisitiveness in a petty way, and rather liking anybody who had the skill and the will to be diplomatic, he now put aside an impulse to shake his head negatively, and observed, "But you haven't had any training in this work." "No, sir, but couldn't I pick it up pretty quick if I tried hard?" "Well, let me see," observed the head of the bellhops, scratching his head dubiously. "I haven't any time to talk to you now. Come around Monday afternoon. I'll see you then." He turned on his heel and walked away. Clyde, left alone in this fashion, and not knowing just what it meant, stared, wondering. Was it really true that he had been invited to come back on Monday? Could it be possible that he turned and hurried out, thrilling from head to toe? The idea. He had asked this man for a place in the very finest hotel in Kansas City, and he had asked him to come back and see him on Monday. Gee. What would that mean? Could it be possible that he would be admitted to such a grand world as this, and that so speedily? Could it really be? Chapter 5. The imaginative flights of Clyde in connection with all this, his dreams of what it might mean for him to be connected with so glorious an institution, can only be suggested. For his ideas of luxury were in the main so extreme and mistaken and gauche, mere wanderings of a repressed and unsatisfied fancy, which as yet had had nothing but imaginings to feed it. He went back to his old duties at the drugstore, to his home after hours in order to eat and sleep, but now for the balance of this Friday and Saturday and Sunday and Monday until late in the day, he walked on air, really. His mind was not on what he was doing, and several times his superior at the drugstore had to remind him to wake up. And after hours, instead of going directly home, he walked north to the corner of 14th and Baltimore, where stood this great hotel, and looked at it. There, at midnight even, before each of the three principal entrances, one facing each of three streets, was a doorman in a long maroon coat with many buttons and a high-rimmed and long-visored maroon cap. And inside, behind looped and fluted French silk curtains, were the still blazing lights, the à la carte dining room and the American grill in the basement near one corner still open. And about them were many taxis and cars. And there was music always, from somewhere. After surveying it all this Friday night and again on Saturday and Sunday morning, he returned on Monday afternoon at the suggestion of Mr. Squires and was greeted by that individual rather crustily, for by then he had all but forgotten him. But seeing that at the moment he was actually in need of help, and being satisfied that Clyde might be of service, he led him into his small office under the stair, where, with a very superior manner and much actual indifference, he proceeded to question him as to his parentage, where he lived, at what he had worked before and what his father did for a living, a poser that for Clyde, for he was proud and so ashamed to admit that his parents conducted a mission and preached on the streets. Instead he replied, which was true at times, that his father canvassed for a washing machine and wringer company, and on Sundays preached a religious revelation, which was not at all displeasing to this master of boys who were inclined to be anything but home-loving and conservative. Could he bring a reference from where he now was? He could. Mr. Squires proceeded to explain that this hotel was very strict. Too many boys, on account of the scenes and the show here, the contact made with undue luxury to which they were not accustomed, though these were not the words used by Mr. Squires, were inclined to lose their heads and go wrong. He was constantly being forced to discharge boys who, because they made a little extra money, didn't know how to conduct themselves. He must have boys who were willing, civil, prompt, courteous to everybody. They must be clean and neat about their persons and clothes and show up promptly, on the dot, and in good condition for the work every day. And any boy who got to thinking that because he made a little money he could flirt with anybody or talk back, or go off on parties at night, and then not show up on time or too tired to be quick and bright, needn't think that he would be here long. He would be fired, and that promptly. He would not tolerate any nonsense. That must be understood now, once and for all. Clyde nodded assent often and interpolated a few eager yes, sirs and no, sirs, and assured him at the last that it was the furthest thing from his thoughts and temperament to dream of any such high crimes and misdemeanors as he had outlined. Mr. Squires then proceeded to explain that this hotel only paid $15 a month and board, at the servants' table in the basement, to any bellboy at any time. But, and this information came as a most amazing revelation to Clyde, every guest for whom any of these boys did anything, carried a bag or delivered a pitcher of water or did anything, gave him a tip, and often quite a liberal one, a dime, 15 cents, a quarter, sometimes more. And these tips, as Mr. Squires explained, taken all together, averaged from $4 to $6 a day, not less and sometimes more. Most amazing pay, as Clyde now realized. His heart gave an enormous bound and was near to suffocating him at the mere mention of so large a sum. From $4 to $6. Why, that was $28 to $42 a week. He could scarcely believe it. And that in addition to the $15 a month and board. And there was no charge, as Mr. Squires now explained, for the handsome uniforms the boys wore. But it might not be worn or taken out of the place. His hours, as Mr. Squires now proceeded to explain, would be as follows: on Mondays, Wednesdays, Fridays, and Sundays, he was to work from 6 in the morning until noon, and then, with 6 hours off, from 6 in the evening until midnight. On Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, he need only work from noon until 6, thus giving him each alternate afternoon or evening to himself. But all his meals were to be taken outside his working hours, and he was to report promptly in uniform for line-up and inspection by his superior exactly 10 minutes before the regular hours of his work began at each watch. As for some other things which were in his mind at the time, Mr. Squires said nothing. There were others, as he knew, who would speak for him. Instead he went on to add, and then quite climactically for Clyde at that time, who had been sitting as one in a daze, "I suppose you are ready to go to work now, aren't you?" Yes, sir," he replied. "Very good." Then he got up and opened the door which had shut them in. "Oscar," he called to a boy seated at the head of the bellboy bench, to which a tallish, rather oversized youth in a tight, neat-looking uniform responded with alacrity. "Take this young man here. Clyde Griffiths is your name, isn't it? Up to the wardrobe on the 12th and see if Jacobs can find a suit to fit. But if he can't, tell him to alter it by tomorrow. I think the one Silsby wore ought to be about right for him." Then he turned to his assistant at the desk, who was at the moment looking on. "I'm giving him a trial, anyhow," he commented. "Have one of the boys coach him a little tonight or whenever he starts in. Go ahead, Oscar," he called to the boy in charge of Clyde. "He's green at this stuff, but I think he'll do," he added to his assistant, as Clyde and Oscar disappeared in the direction of one of the elevators. Then he walked off to have Clyde's name entered upon the payroll. In the meantime, Clyde, in tow of this new mentor, was listening to a line of information such as never previously had come to his ears anywhere. "You needn't be frightened, if you ain't never worked at anything like this before," began this youth, whose last name was Helland as Clyde later learned, and who hailed from Jersey City, New Jersey, exotic lingo, gestures and all. He was tall, vigorous, sandy-haired, freckled, genial and voluble. They had entered upon an elevator labeled employees. "It ain't so hard. I got my first job in Buffalo 3 years ago and I never knowed a ting about it up to dat time. All you gotta do is to watch the others and see how they do, see? You get dat, do you?" Clyde, whose education was not a little superior to that of his guide, commented quite sharply in his own mind on the use of such words as knowed, and gotta, also appointing, dat, others, and so on. But so grateful was he for any courtesy at this time that he was inclined to forgive his obviously kindly mentor anything for his geniality. "Watch whoever's doin' anything, at first, see, till you get to know, see. Dat's the way. When the bell rings, if you're at the head of the bench, it's your turn, see, and you jump up and go quick. Dey like you to be quick around here, see. And whenever you see anyone come in the door or out of an elevator with a bag, and you're at the head of the bench, you jump, whether the captain rings the bell or calls front or not. Sometimes he's busy or ain't lookin' and he wants you to do dat, see. Look sharp, 'cause if you don't get no bags, you don't get no tips, see. Everybody that has a bag or anything has to have it carried for 'em, unless they won't let you have it, see. But be sure and wait somewhere near the desk for whoever comes in until they sign up for a room, He rattled on as they ascended in the elevator. Most everyone takes a room. Then the clerk'll give you the key, and after that all you gotta do is to carry up the bags to the room. Then all you gotta do is to turn on the lights in the bedroom and closet, if there is one, so they'll know where they are, see? And then raise the curtains in the daytime or lower 'em at night, and see if there's towels in the room, so you can tell the maid if there ain't, and then if they don't give you no tip, you gotta go, only most times, unless you draw a stiff, all you gotta do is hang back a little, make a stall, see? Fumble with the door key or try the transom, see? Then, if they're any good, they'll hand you a tip. If they don't, you're out, that's all, see? You can't even look as though you was sore, dough, nothin' like that, see? Then you come down, and unless they want ice water or somethin', you're through, see? It's back to the bench, quick. There ain't much to it. Only you gotta be quick all the time, see, and not let anyone get by you comin' or goin', that's the main thing. And after they give you your uniform, and you go to work, don't forget to give the captain $1 after every watch before you leave, see? $2 on the day you has 2 watches, and $1 on the day you has 1, see? That's the way it is here. We work together like that, and you gotta do that if you want to hold your job. But that's all. After that all the rest is yours. Clyde saw a part of his $24 or $32 as he figured it was going glimmering, apparently, 11 or 12 all told, but what of it? Would there not be 12 or 15 or even more left? And there were his meals and his uniform. Kind heaven! What a realization of paradise! What a consummation of luxury! Mr. Helland of Jersey City escorted him to the 12th floor and into a room where they found on guard a wizened and grizzled little old man of doubtful age and temperament, who forthwith fitted Clyde with a suit that was so near a fit that, without further orders, it was not deemed necessary to alter it. And trying on various caps, there was one that fitted him, a thing that sat most rakishly over one ear, only, as Helland informed him, you'll have to get that hair of yours cut. Better get it clipped behind. It's too long. And with that Clyde himself had been in mental agreement before he spoke. His hair certainly did not look right in the new cap. He hated it now. And going downstairs, and reporting to Mr. Whipple, Mr. Squire's assistant, the latter had said, "Very well. It fits all right, does it? Well, then, you go on here at 6. Report at 5:30 and be here in your uniform at 5:45 for inspection." Whereupon Clyde, being advised by Helland to go then and there to get his uniform and take it to the dressing room in the basement, and get his locker from the lockerman, he did so, and then hurried most nervously out, first to get a haircut and afterwards to report to his family on his great luck. He was to be a bellboy in the great Hotel Green Davidson. He was to wear a uniform and a handsome one. He was to make, but he did not tell his mother at first what he was to make, truly, but more than 11 or 12 at first, anyhow, he guessed, he could not be sure. For now, all at once, he saw economic independence ahead for himself, if not for his family, and he did not care to complicate it with any claims which a confession as to his real salary would most certainly inspire. But he did say that he was to have his meals free, because that meant eating away from home, which was what he wished. And in addition he was to live and move always in the glorious atmosphere of this hotel, not to have to go home ever before 12, if he did not wish, to have good clothes, interesting company, maybe, a good time, gee. And as he hurried on about his various errands now, it occurred to him as a final and shrewd and delicious thought that he need not go home on such nights as he wished to go to a theater or anything like that. He could just stay downtown and say he had to work. And that with free meals and good clothes, think of that. The mere thought of all this was so astonishing and entrancing that he could not bring himself to think of it too much. He must wait and see. He must wait and see just how much he would make here in this perfectly marvelous realm. Chapter 6. And as conditions stood, the extraordinary economic and social inexperience of the Griffiths, Asa and Elvira, dovetailed all too neatly with his dreams. For neither Asa nor Elvira had the least knowledge of the actual character of the work upon which he was about to enter, scarcely any more than he did, or what it might mean to him morally, imaginatively, financially, or in any other way. For neither of them had ever stopped in a hotel above the fourth class in all their days. Neither one had ever eaten in a restaurant of a class that catered to other than individuals of their own low financial level. That there could be any other forms of work or contact than those involved in carrying the bags of guests to and from the door of a hotel to its office, and back again, for a boy of Clyde's years and temperament, never occurred to them. And it was naively assumed by both that the pay for such work must of necessity be very small anywhere, say $5 or $6 a week, and so actually below Clyde's deserts and his years. And in view of this, Mrs. Griffiths, who was more practical than her husband at all times, and who was intensely interested in Clyde's economic welfare, as well as that of her other children, was actually wondering why Clyde should of a sudden become so enthusiastic about changing to this new situation, which, according to his own story, involved longer hours and not so very much more pay, if any. To be sure, he had already suggested that it might lead to some superior position in the hotel, some clerkship or other, but he did not know when that would be, and the other had promised rather definite fulfillment somewhat earlier, as to money, anyhow. But seeing him rush in on Monday afternoon and announce that he had secured the place and that forthwith he must change his tie and collar and get his hair cut and go back and report, she felt better about it. For never before had she seen him so enthusiastic about anything, and it was something to have him more content with himself, not so moody, as he was at times. Yet, the hours which he began to maintain now, from 6 in the morning until midnight, with only an occasional early return on such evenings as he chose to come home when he was not working, and when he troubled to explain that he had been let off a little early, together with a certain eager and restless manner, a desire to be out and away from his home at nearly all such moments as he was not in bed or dressing or undressing, puzzled his mother and Asa, also. The hotel. The hotel. He must always hurry off to the hotel, and all that he had to report was that he liked it ever so much, and that he was doing all right, he thought. It was nicer work than working around a soda fountain, and he might be making more money pretty soon, he couldn't tell, but as for more than that he either wouldn't or couldn't say. And all the time the Griffiths, father and mother, were feeling that because of the affair in connection with Esta, they should really be moving away from Kansas City, should go to Denver. And now more than ever, Clyde was insisting that he did not want to leave Kansas City. They might go, but he had a pretty good job now and wanted to stick to it. And if they left, he could get a room somewhere, and would be all right, a thought which did not appeal to them at all. But in the meantime what an enormous change in Clyde's life. Beginning with that first evening, when at 5:45, he appeared before Mr. Whipple, his immediate superior, and was approved, not only because of the fit of his new uniform, but for his general appearance, the world for him had changed entirely. Lined up with 7 others in the servants' hall, immediately behind the general offices in the lobby, and inspected by Mr. Whipple, the squad of 8 marched at the stroke of 6 through a door that gave into the lobby on the other side of the staircase from where stood Mr. Whipple's desk, then about and in front of the general registration office to the long bench on the other side. A Mr. Barnes, who alternated with Mr. Whipple, then took charge of the assistant captain's desk, and the boys seated themselves, Clyde at the foot, only to be called swiftly and in turn to perform this, that and the other service, while the relieved squad of Mr. Whipple was led away into the rear servants' hall as before, where they disbanded. Cling. The bell on the room clerk's desk had sounded and the first boy was going. Cling. It sounded again and a second boy leaped to his feet. Front, center door. Called Mr. Barnes, and a third boy was skidding down the long marble floor toward that entrance to seize the bags of an incoming guest, whose white whiskers and youthful, bright tweed suit were visible to Clyde's uninitiated eyes 100 feet away. A mysterious and yet sacred vision, a tip. Front. It was Mr. Barnes calling again. See what 913 wants, ice water, I guess. And a fourth boy was gone. Clyde, steadily moving up along the bench and adjoining Helland, who had been detailed to instruct him a little, was all eyes and ears and nerves. He was so tense that he could hardly breathe, and fidgeted and jerked until finally Helland exclaimed, "Now, don't get excited. Just hold your horses, will you? You'll be all right. You're just like I was when I begun, all noives. But that ain't the way. Easy's what you gotta be around here. And you wants to look as though you wasn't seen nobody nowhere, just look into what you got before ya. Front. Mr. Barnes again." Clyde was scarcely able to keep his mind on what Helland was saying. 115 wants some writing paper and pens. A fifth boy had gone. Where do you get writing paper and pens if they want 'em? He pleaded of his instructor, as one who was about to die might plead. "Off and a key desk, I told ya. He's to the left over there. He'll give 'em to ya. And you gets ice water in the hall we lined up in just a minute ago, at that end over there. See, you'll see a little door. You gotta give that guy in there a dime once in a while or he'll get sore." Cling. The room clerk spell. A sixth boy had gone without a word to supply some order in that direction. "And now remember," continued Helland, seeing that he himself was next, and cautioning him for the last time, "if they wants drinks of any kind, you get 'em in the grill over there oven the dining room. And be sure and get the names of the drinks straight or they'll get sore. And if it's a room you're showing, pull the shades down tonight and turn on the lights. And if it's anything from the dining room you gotta see the head waiter, he gets the tip, see?" Front. He was up and gone. And Clyde was number 1. And number 4 was already seating himself again by his side, but looking shrewdly around to see if anybody was wanted anywhere. Front. It was Mr. Barnes. Clyde was up and before him, grateful that it was no one coming in with bags, but worried for fear it might be something that he would not understand or could not do quickly. "See what 882 wants." Clyde was off toward one of the 2 elevators marked, "Employees," the proper one to use, he thought, because he had been taken to the 12th floor that way, but another boy stepping out from one of the fast passenger elevators cautioned him as to his mistake. "Go into a room?" he called. "Use the guest elevators. Them's for the servants or anybody with bundles." Clyde hastened to cover his mistake. 8, he called. There being no one else on the elevator with them, the Negro elevator boy in charge of the car saluted him at once. "You's new, ain't you? I ain't seen you around here before." "Yes, I just came on," replied Clyde. "Well, you won't hate it here," commented this youth in the most friendly way. "No one hates this house, I'll say." "8 did you say?" He stopped the car and Clyde stepped out. He was too nervous to think to ask the direction and now began looking at room numbers, only to decide after a moment that he was in the wrong corridor. The soft brown carpet under his feet, the soft, cream-tinted walls, the snow-white bowl lights in the ceiling, all seemed to him parts of a perfection and a social superiority which was almost unbelievable, so remote from all that he had ever known. And finally, finding 882, he knocked timidly and was greeted after a moment by a segment of a very stout and vigorous body in a blue and white striped union suit and a related segment of a round and florid head in which was set one eye and some wrinkles to one side of it. "Here's a $1 bill, son," said the eye seemingly, and now a hand appeared holding a paper dollar. It was fat and red. "You go out to a haberdasher's and get me a pair of garters, Boston garters, silk, and hurry back." "Yes, sir," replied Clyde, and took the dollar. The door closed and he found himself hustling along the hall toward the elevator, wondering what a haberdasher's was. As old as he was 17, the name was new to him. He had never even heard it before, or noticed it at least. If the man had said a gents' furnishing store, he would have understood at once, but now here he was told to go to a haberdasher's and he did not know what it was. A cold sweat burst out upon his forehead. His knees trembled. The devil! What would he do now? Could he ask anyone, even Helland, and not seem? He pushed the elevator button. The car began to descend. A haberdasher! A haberdasher! Suddenly a sane thought reached him. Supposing he didn't know what a haberdasher was? After all, the man wanted a pair of silk Boston garters. Where did one get silk Boston garters? At a store, of course, a place where they sold things for men. Certainly. A gents' furnishing store. He would run out to a store. And on the way down, noting another friendly Negro in charge, he asked, "Do you know if there's a gents' furnishing store anywhere around here?" "One in the building, Captain, right outside the south lobby," replied the Negro, and Clyde hurried there, greatly relieved. Yet he felt odd and strange in his close-fitting uniform and his peculiar hat. All the time he was troubled by the notion that his small, round, tight-fitting hat might fall off. And he kept pressing it furtively and yet firmly down. And bustling into the haberdasher's, which was blazing with lights outside, he exclaimed, "I want to get a pair of Boston silk garters." "All right, son, here you are," replied a sleek, short man with bright, bald head, pink face and gold-rimmed glasses. "For someone in the hotel, I presume? Well, we'll make that 75 cents, and here's a dime for you," he remarked as he wrapped up the package and dropped the dollar in the cash register. "I always like to do the right thing by you boys in there because I know you come to me whenever you can." Clyde took the dime and the package, not knowing quite what to think. "The garters must be 75 cents, he said so. Hence only 25 cents need to be returned to the man. Then the dime was his. And now, maybe, would the man really give him another tip? He hurried back into the hotel and up to the elevators. The strains of a string orchestra somewhere were filling the lobby with delightful sounds. People were moving here and there, so well dressed, so much at ease, so very different from most of the people in the streets or anywhere, as he saw it. An elevator door flew open. Various guests entered. Then Clyde and another bellboy who gave him an interested glance. At the 6th floor the boy departed. At the 8th Clyde and an old lady stepped forth. He hurried to the door of his guest and tapped. The man opened it, somewhat more fully dressed than before. He had on a pair of trousers and was shaving. "Back, eh?" he called. "Yes, sir," replied Clyde, handing him the package and change. "He said it was 75 cents. He's a damned robber, but you can keep the change, just the same," he replied, handing him the quarter and closing the door. Clyde stood there, quite spellbound for the fraction of a second. 35 cents, he thought, 35 cents. And for one little short errand. Could that really be the way things went here? It couldn't be, really. It wasn't possible, not always. And then, his feet sinking in the soft nap of the carpet, his hand in one pocket clutching the money, he felt as if he could squeal or laugh out loud. Why, 35 cents, and for a little service like that. This man had given him a quarter and the other a dime and he hadn't done anything at all. He hurried from the car at the bottom. The strains of the orchestra once more fascinated him, the wonder of so well-dressed a throng thrilling him, and made his way to the bench from which he had first departed. And following this he had been called to carry the 3 bags and 2 umbrellas of an aged farmer-like couple, who had engaged a parlor, bedroom and bath on the 5th floor. En route they kept looking at him, as he could see, but said nothing. Yet once in their room, and after he had promptly turned on the lights near the door, lowered the blinds and placed the bags upon the bag racks, the middle-aged and rather awkward husband, a decidedly solemn and bewhiskered person, studied him and finally observed, "Young fella, you seem to be a nice, brisk sort of boy, rather better than most we've seen so far, I must say." "I certainly don't think that hotels are any place for boys," chirped up the wife of his bosom, a large and rotund person, who by this time was busily employed inspecting an adjoining room. "I certainly wouldn't want any of my boys to work in 'em, the way people act. But here, young man," went on the elder, laying off his overcoat and fishing in his trousers pocket. "You go down and get me 3 or 4 evening papers if there are that many and a pitcher of ice water, and I'll give you 15 cents when you get back. This hotel's better'n the one in Omaha, Pa," added the wife sententiously. "It's got nicer carpets and curtains." And as green as Clyde was, he could not help smiling secretly. Openly, however, he preserved a mask-like solemnity, seemingly effacing all facial evidence of thought, and took the change and went out. And in a few moments he was back with the ice water and all the evening papers and departed smilingly with his 15 cents. But this, in itself, was but a beginning insofar as this particular evening was concerned, for he was scarcely seated upon the bench again, before he was called to room 529, only to be sent to the bar for drinks, 2 ginger ales and 2 siphons of soda, and this by a group of smartly dressed young men and girls who were laughing and chattering in the room, one of whom opened the door just wide enough to instruct him as to what was wanted. But because of a mirror over the mantel, he could see the party and one pretty girl in a white suit and cap, sitting on the edge of a chair in which reclined a young man who had his arm about her. Clyde stared, even while pretending not to. And in his state of mind, this sight was like looking through the gates of paradise. Here were young fellows and girls in this room, not so much older than himself, laughing and talking and drinking even, not ice cream sodas and the like, but such drinks no doubt as his mother and father were always speaking against as leading to destruction, and apparently nothing was thought of it. He bustled down to the bar, and having secured the drinks and a charge slip, returned, and was paid $1.50 for the drinks and $1.25 for himself. And once more he had a glimpse of the appealing scene. Only now one of the couples was dancing to a tune sung and whistled by the other two. But what interested him as much as the visits to and glimpses of individuals in the different rooms, was the moving panorama of the main lobby, the character of the clerks behind the main desk, room clerk, key clerk, mail clerk, cashier and assistant cashier. And the various stands about the place, flower stand, news stand, cigar stand, telegraph office, taxicab office, and all manned by individuals who seemed to him curiously filled with the atmosphere of this place. And then around and between all these walking or sitting were such imposing men and women, young men and girls all so fashionably dressed, all so ruddy and contented looking. And the cars or other vehicles in which some of them appeared about dinner time and later. It was possible for him to see them in the flare of the lights outside. The wraps, furs, and other belongings in which they appeared, or which were often carried by these other boys and himself across the great lobby and into the cars or the dining room or the several elevators. And they were always of such gorgeous textures, as Clyde saw them. Such grandeur. This, then, most certainly was what it meant to be rich, to be a person of consequence in the world, to have money. It meant that you did what you pleased. That other people, like himself, waited upon you. That you possessed all of these luxuries. That you went how, where and when you pleased.